Hey guys, what is up? SuperKmanrocks here, and we are here for my LCK Round 2 overview and analysis. Playoffs are really moving along now. Basically, in every region, we've gotten to cover the LCS. We've basically gotten to the end of the NACL, and we're really moving along in the LCK. A lot of really fun stuff going on in League of Legends right now. A lot of great games being played pretty much everywhere across the world. And of course, when there are great games in other regions, that means there are also great games in the LCK. They very rarely fall behind these other leagues in terms of dominance and in terms of enjoyment. And that's really what we got this week. I'm incredibly excited to go over our round 2 games, that being the two series between the two teams that were able to move on from round 1, as well as the two teams that got a bye in round number 1. If you want a kind of an idea of what I felt about those series, as well as the previews that I did for these series that are going to be taking place in this video, check out the video up in the iCard, my round 1 overview and analysis. I promise you're going to enjoy that, especially if you're looking for that kind of content. But today, I'm excited to talk about round 2, and if you're excited to hear about it, let me know down in the comments section below. I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts. These series were incredibly fun, incredibly back and forth, and incredibly close, and so I'm really interested to see what you guys' thoughts and opinions are on a lot of these games. But without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into it. We're going to be covering both matchups in this series, starting off with our number 1 seed in the LCK taking on their Telecom War rivals. We had number 1 seeded T1 taking on the number 3 seeded KT Rolster. Now, you might be wondering why the 3 seed is taking on the 1 seed in the first round or the second round of the playoffs here. T1 actually had their selection of teams because they were the top seed. They got to choose which of the 2 teams that won in round 1 they wanted to play, and they chose KT Rolster, and I completely agree. Not because I think that they are objectively better than a team like Hanwha Life, but rather, I think Hanwha Life is just so volatile. It is very difficult to determine which kind of team you are going to be getting from game to game, and T1 historically has just done a lot better in the KT Rolster matchup. They always play their Telecom War rivals tough, and I certainly don't expect that to be different in their first playoff series of 2023, but KT Rolster is certainly not a pushover. This is very likely a top 3 team in the LCK, which really does mean a lot. You know, I'm sure we all know that means a lot. The consistency of this team is really what has impressed me over the recent weeks. We know they've had talent. BDD was an MVP candidate. Aiming and Lehens have been incredibly solid as a duo. Keen is one of the only top laners in the league that can genuinely go up against Zeus. And Cuz, for his credit, has been really good over the back half of the split. And so, a lot of really interesting matchups here. T1 obviously going in as favorites, but certainly not a series that you can take lightly on either side. So, we're going to be going game by game. You guys know how we do it on this channel at this point. So, kicking us off with game number 1. The winner of game number 1 was T1. They are able to take the first game of the series. They're able to go up 1-0, which is really strong. You know, the difference between going up 1-0 and 0-1 is like, you know, 75% win percentage. It's something ludicrous like that. And it just goes to show you the power of momentum when it comes to a series like this. Obviously, it's not completely insurmountable, but T1 played a very stereotypical T1 game in this one. It was a ridiculously slow early game. I don't even think we got first blood until like 13 minutes into the game. That's pretty typical of T1. Maybe not so much in 2023 when they were just kind of throwing shit at the wall, but when you look at their past playoff performances, especially as a 5-man unit, the same 5-man unit they're running out for this series, this is the kind of style I think they feel a lot more comfortable playing, but they do end up getting first blood down in the bot lane. Keria and Guma go for the Death Brush strategy and are able to pick off a very low mobility Aiming, who doesn't even have his Gale Force yet. But that goes to undersell, I think, a lot of what Guma and Keria were able to do in the early game. As you can see up on your screen, Gumayushi is going to be my player of the game here in game number 1. It's not just the scoreline either. I mean, he obliterated Aiming in the lane phase. I think he was up like 50 CS at 12, 13 minutes into the game. Something ludicrous like that. Like, this matchup was not particularly close. Yes, Lucian Nami should have a ton of prio into something like a Felios Lulu, but you should not be losing at this dominant of a clip. It is very difficult for me to imagine a world in which this bot lane matchup goes this poorly and you're still expected to win. T1 did a great job being able to control objectives from that point. They were stacking dragons, they were getting Rift Heralds, they were basically doing everything in the game that you needed to do. KT felt really desperate, so they tried to make a play on the top side. They went all in, trying to get Faker down, you know, trying to kill him, and you know, it's Faker. He ulted Keen back under his tower and ended up surviving, and then all of a sudden KT is overextended, and Cuz ends up dying. Do a great job from Owner. Like, it's just what T1 does. They make you think that they are some way, somehow out of position, and then they pull the plug, they pull the trigger on being able to capitalize on it. T1 did a really good job of just being able to strangle out the game. Now, I will say it got a little contentious towards the back half. KT Rolster with a really good Baron steal that did kind of set up some interesting scenarios, but they end up getting, you know, kind of almost aced in that fight immediately after Baron. They give over the Elder Dragon, and from that point on in the game, there's really just not a lot they can do. T1's not going to make a major mistake. They play it slow, they play it calculated, and they're able to close it out. This is just a stereotypical T1 win. Guma and Keria getting super far ahead in the early game like they have all year long. Faker legitimately being the unkillable Demon King on the Cassante. Always a huge benefit when your mid laner can pull out something like Cassante. It's not something that a lot of players are going to be willing to pull out because it honestly is pretty high execution in the mid lane, but Faker's just one of those players that can make it work even into something like Vigar that theoretically should be able to deal with it. And then Owner on something like an Elise to be able to set the pace early, even though they weren't picking up kills. The gold lead and just the overall momentum of the series was firmly in favor of T1. Faker, Guma, Keria, all great, but Guma's player of the game. As for KT Rolster, aiming's done of the game. This is a no-brainer. He was down 50 CS at like 12 minutes. I understand that you're on a scaling champion, but you simply cannot lose that bad. He gives over first blood. The ultimates towards the back half of the game really aren't doing any damage. There's really just not a lot that he's actually accomplishing in game number 1. I obviously think that he could have a much better game in game number 2, but game 1 was not particularly good. It wasn't great for really anybody on the team. Keen wasn't really all that useful on Renekton. BDD got a winning matchup that he absolutely should have been able to punish and just wasn't able to do it, and then Cuz just lost pressure very early on to the Elise and never was really able to rebound. It was a nice Baron steal from him, but outside of that, really not a lot going on the side of KT Rolster. I still think they have the opportunity to bounce back. This team is incredibly solid, but T1 playing T1's game is very, very difficult to beat, and that's what we saw in Game 1. But are they going to be able to take the 2-0 series lead, or is KT going to tie things up at 1-1? You know how important I think Game 2 is. You do not want to go down 2-0 against T1 and have to be expected to win 3 games in a row against this team. And so this is a must-win, in my opinion, for KT Rolster. Are they able to pull it out? Well, the winner of Game number 2 was KT Rolster. They are able to pick up a win here in game number 2 and even up the series at 1 apiece. This is massive. Like I said, you really do not want to be the team that goes down 2-0 to T1. That is a massive hole to dig yourself into that you probably just aren't going to be able to climb out of. So what do? They go to Comfort. They put Keen on something really aggressive in the top lane. They put BDD on Twisted Fate, which is wild. Certainly not a pick that we're really seeing all that much around the world right now. I think Twisted Fate is pretty weak. I mean, obviously, he still does TF things. Gold card is still really good, and obviously, Global Pressure is always going to be good, but his damage output is just very poor right now, especially compared to someone like Talia, who I think fills a relatively similar role, I would say, overall. But you're going to Wukong for Cuz. That's been his best champion. Aiming in Lehen's on something. Lehen's on an Engager. That's good. It's just a lot of comfort on the side of KT Rolster, and it absolutely works out here in game number 2. It's not to say that T1's not on comfort. I mean, Zeus on Gnar is pretty strong. And then Keria on and Marksman is obviously pretty pog in 2023. But overall, it was definitely KT that felt a lot more comfortable in this game. My player of the game is going to go to Keen in the top lane. We'll talk about it a bit, but T1 really did try to split the map vertically in the beginning part of the game. They were totally fine giving away things like dragons and bot lane pressure early on in the game, which is wild to me, considering you're playing Zeri Ashe. Like, this is a bot lane that I would expect you to actually want to play to, considering the fact that it's Gnar versus Jack's topside. It's not really something that you're going to be able to take advantage of at, like, a super high level. And then it's Kassadin in the mid lane. Certainly not something that's going to have prio early on against a Twisted Fate. But, you know, T1 wanted topside. They wanted Herald. They pressured it really hard. And, you know, they were willing to give up dragons basically for free in order to get prio on it. But KT Rolster wanted to fight. They certainly weren't going to, you know, roll over and die. They did not accept the 50-50 trade that T1 was offering. They said, we want it all, and they went and took it. A really good Rift Herald fight coming out from KT that gives them a pretty early lead, but they promptly throw that early lead by giving Guma a Quadra at around 12 minutes in a second dragon fight. Not exactly what you're looking for, giving Zeri a Quadra at 12 minutes. From that point on in the game, it really did feel like T1 was just going to run away with it because Gumayushi with a Quadra kill on Zeri at 12 minutes feels unstoppable. Add into that the fact that you have Faker scaling on the Kassadin, you've got Keria playing Ashe. It just felt like a really good recipe to be able to win, but the problem is, Jax is real strong up on the top side. KT was super lucky to have a player like Keen in the top lane actually be able to take advantage of Zeus in this laning phase, because the Jax became a massive problem. He couldn't be stopped by absolutely anybody. He was shredding frontline immediately. You can talk about like kind of the weak frontline that T1 had. The Gnar that was building full damage because it's Zeus, and that's what he's done all year. Owner, who was not really all that tanky because it's Vi, who didn't really get a ton of gold in the early game. Like, Jax is going to absolutely shred through the front line of T1, and he did. Like, there really wasn't a lot that they could do. Unfortunately, again, you know, back and forth, KT had some miserable objective control over the back half of this game. They gave away not one, but 2 Baron steals across the back half, both of them not to the jungler, but to Faker on the Kassadin, which is just not particularly good. They do get the Ocean Soul, but they get aced for it. It's really like, man, if KT just had, like, average macro, this game would be completely over, but they're actively throwing this game away. There really isn't a lot that they can do. Luckily for them, T1 wants to win even less, and they way overextend after a fight in the top side jungle. They go way, way too deep, thinking, oh, you know, KT doesn't have the damage, and Keen absolutely demolishes them with enough time in that fight. I think it's like a 4-for-0. And it ends up putting KT right back into the driver's seat. It's relatively even, but KT has a lot of the momentum. And that brings us to our Elder fight, which is going to close out the game, which luckily for KT fans, they were able to win. They were able to secure the fight early on, and then Cuz goes back to get the dragon. They were able to clean things up, and then basically just end the game off of that. It's not the cleanest performance in the entire world coming out from KT, but seeing Keen play so well on the Jax and be such a crucial member towards this team's success is massive. We've been talking about how, you know, there's this narrative that Zeus is kind of untouchable in the top lane when it comes to other top laners in the LCK, and while I do kind of agree, Keen is really the only one in that conversation that's going to be able to touch him from a mechanics standpoint, and that's what we had here. He dominated laning phase, and he looked really good towards the back half of the game. Keen's had a really good playoff so far, and that doesn't really seem to be stopping here. I thought Lahens was the other player that I really wanted to give a big shout out to. Some of those engages on Leona, particularly that one in that top side jungle fight, incredibly important towards this team actually winning the game. The Jax, the Leona, definitely the 2 standout members, but aiming was doing damage. Cuz had some good, you know, some good plays. He gave up a couple more Barons than I would have liked, but, you know, Ashe arrows can be a little bit of a bitch every once in a while, and then BDD on the TF. You know, he was a gold card bot. He's not really going to be doing a lot of damage. That champion doesn't do a lot of damage right now. And so, overall, KT, you know, they were good. Still definitely some question marks because of the macro and the objective control in the late game, but winning a game off of T1 is certainly not easy, and they were able to do it here. As for T1, I'm not going to hit the panic button. You actually did a really good job trying to claw your way back into this game after basically throwing it away once your Gumayushi, once your bot laner had a quadra kill. You played the mid game so poorly that the fact that you were even in it in the late game because of some really nice plays from Faker is just a credit to T1. I'm not going to overreact and try and panic too much. The only thing that does concern me a bit is Zeus in the top lane, and not really because of the mechanics. Like, you're going to lose every once in a while, especially against a player like Keen. It was more so the decision of going full damage on Gnar when your team has no actual frontline against a Jax. Like, you have to build some level of armor on the side of T1 in order to do anything against that Jax to try and stop him even a little bit in these extended fights. I do think if he had maybe a little bit extra armor in this game, there's a chance that this game swings the other way, and that's kind of a question mark. He's a player who typically does just like building damage on basically every champion he plays, whether or not they are a damage carry, you know, or not. But I do think that when you get into a playoff series where it can be a little bit more crucial what your item build is, you may need to think a little bit more about going full tank in situations like this, or at least off tank, like bruiser tank, right? Zeus was going full damage though, and it did not end up working out. But on, you know, outside of that, T1 just kind of played a T1 game. They weren't able to get that early lead because they picked a super late game comp with Kassadin and Zeri. And then outside of that, they just weren't able to clean it up in the end. They made one mistake after, you know, trying to claw their way back into this game, and that's going to be enough for them to lose. I still think that they should be favorites to come out of this series, but, you know, losing a game here certainly is something that should stick in a lot of people's minds. As for KT, hopefully this win gives you some confidence. I think that's really what you're going to be looking for here. Maybe not so much, you know, the way that you won, because the way that you won wasn't exactly the most convincing in the entire world, but beating T1 is certainly a confidence booster, and they should be able to take that into the future games in this series. So who's going to be able to take the lead back? Is it going to be T1 kind of reclaiming that lead, or is KT Rolster actually going to take the lead in game number 3? Well, the winner of game number 3 was T1. They are able to take game number 3, and, you know, game number 2, pretty back and forth. KT kind of showing a lot of merit. T1 taking control of the series again in pretty dominant fashion. I think you could argue that this game was even more dominant than their game 1 win, which, you know, was certainly already pretty dominant from T1 in particular, but this was over pretty early on in the game. I think some people would say it was over in draft because you're looking at a T1 lineup that has a winning bot lane. You've got Faker on something that can scale into his team fight phase, which he's been great on over the course of the year. Zeus on Cassante, which means he doesn't really have the option to run it down in the early game like he did on Gnar. And then Owner on Lee Sin, which is just a cheat code. Like, it is a global cheat code. You have to ban this champion against this team every single game. It simply does not matter. It is not fair. He's got like a career, what, like 91, 92% win percentage on the champion. He is the best jungler in the world, and it's not particularly close on Lee Sin. Like, there is no one that can even contest him, in my opinion, when he gets this champion. And that's what we got here in game number 3. Owner's gonna get the player of the game. Big shock. It felt like he was literally everywhere at once. It's really hard to watch a game like this and not just be like, man, playing against Owner is so ridiculously unfair. Like, having to deal with Lee Sin over and over again. Like, a 2v1 in the mid lane. Oh, but Lee Sin shows up, and all of a sudden, they're able to turn it into a 2v2, and Lee Sin gets the first blood, and then Keria is roaming up, and all of a sudden T1 turn it into a 2-for-1. It's like, oh, how's that fair? And then all of a sudden, you know, in the bot lane after Keria makes this weird play where he ends up dying for no reason, you know, then all of a sudden Owner shows up bot lane and helps Gumayushi settle the wave and be able to take down aiming, and then randomly Zeus gets a kill in top lane on Keen, and Cuz is like, oh, I finally have a chance to be able to counteract it, but then Owner shows up there. It's like, dude, how do you have the time to show up at literally every single part of the map all the time? Like, it is genuinely impressive how he is able to play the game. It's almost unfair to play into him, and he just had a really good one. There's really not a lot else to say. Basically, from 15 minutes into this game, it was over. Owner was able to generate that kind of lead for his team, but it wasn't just him. Want to give a lot of credit to Zeus in the top lane. Like I said, he was able to solo kill Keen in the early laning phase. He almost died to Cuz on the rebound there, but Owner obviously saved him there. But just generally, Zeus looked a lot better in this game than he did in game number 2 against Keen's Jax. Good to see the progression coming out from him. Faker continues to be really good on the Kassadin. Even if he's not like a focal point for the team, I actually think BDD played relatively well in this game, keeping KT alive for most of the mid game until he made some pretty bad positioning mistakes. But, you know, Faker I don't think was necessarily bad. And then Guma and Keria. Keria had that one moment where he just completely ran it down in the bot lane to give a free kill over to aiming. But outside of that, those two were nearly perfect. A lot of really good roams coming out from Keria, and Gumayushi just does so much damage on this champion. Overall, T1 played great. There's really not a lot of negative things I can say about them. As for KT, not good. I mean, you wanted to be able to carry that momentum from the game 2 win into game 3 here. It just did not happen. You got out jungled super hard early. Cuz is going to get my dud of the game here. You know, I didn't want to bring this up in the pre-match, you know, predictions or anything like that, but Owner kind of just has Cuz's number, or at least he has over the course of their careers up until this point, basically no matter who those two play for, especially last year. Owner and Cuz very much felt like Owner's best matchup. Now, that's not to say Cuz has not had good performances. I thought he was really good in game number 2 that we just saw, but, you know, historically speaking, this has been rather rough for him as a jungler, and I think that came out again here in game number 3. Keen getting solo killed, aiming, and Lehens basically having no pressure. It was really up to BDD in the mid game, but then eventually he just got way too aggro because it felt like he probably, or at least I can assume he felt like he had to be the one to carry the game, and ended up mispositioning on the Veigar a couple of times. But overall, KT Rolster just did not look competent at all in this game. They were blown back basically from moment 1. They really weren't in this one at all, and that makes 2 games now that they are down. It really doesn't look good for their chances at this series. I'm not going to completely count them out or anything like that, but there really isn't a lot of analysis that I can do here. T1 just used Owner's pressure to be able to close out the game really, really cleanly. There really isn't a lot that I could possibly talk about. If you're KT, you gotta hope to get something closer to game 2, but when you're looking at the series as a whole, both of your losses have been the 2 most dominant games of the series. Not exactly a good look for you. It's not exactly a great momentum builder going into game number 4, but obviously it is win or go to lower bracket. Nobody's eliminated in this video. That is something I need to reiterate. You know, the loser of the series ends up going to lower bracket, but, you know, KT, if they don't get their act together in game number 4 here, it's probably going to be them. And then for T1, this is just a classic T1 performance, just choking out the enemy team, being really aggressive in the early game and translating that lead into the late game with a hyper carry mid laner, something that they've done really well over the course of the last year or so. They did this really well at Worlds. This was a style that particularly worked for them at that tournament, but when they're on, man. Like, they have to make mistakes in order for KT to be in this series. As much as I love KT, that's just kind of been the truth of how this series has gone. So, is T1 going to be able to close it out in 4 games, or is KT Rolster going to bring us to a kind of surprising game number 5? Well, the winner of game number 4 was KT Rolster. They are able to take game number 4, and they're able to push us to a Silver Scrapes game number 5 here in the Telecom War. How could you ask for more? I mean, you know, a Telecom War best of 5 going to all 5 games in the playoffs. I mean, that's absolutely huge. Both of these teams stepping up kind of in different ways throughout this series. T1's just had some really good early games, but KT Rolster actually fixed a lot of the issues that I was having with them in the early parts of this series in this game 4. This actually gave me a lot of confidence in them, quite frankly, as a team. This was a really solid early game and a really good macro game in general coming out from KT Rolster, and I think that's what makes me feel a lot better. And pretty much all of it is facilitated by the best player on this team, BDD, in the mid lane, who has just been awesome for KT Rolster over the split. An MVP caliber player in the mid lane for them, and he's pulling out the Twisted Fate. Again, I criticize this pick in game 2 because I'm like, man, you know, if you have a little bit more damage, maybe you're able to turn some of these fights, but the impact that TF can cause, especially from ahead, is absolutely catastrophic for this T1 team to have to deal with, and quite frankly, they didn't deal with it. They had no way of dealing with it in this game. BDD is a really easy choice for player of the game. First of all, you have a big dragon fight around 8-ish minutes that ends up being, I believe, a 4 for 2 in favor of KT Rolster. Incredibly deadly, but you do get the Twisted Fate on the board, and then he immediately makes use of that gold by going top lane, picking up Zeus, who's playing way too aggro in a matchup where he doesn't have the ability to back off if TF just comes in with gold card. And then it's like, oh, okay, man, TF is strong, but then you have this big fight around the mid lane where it's like, oh, you know, maybe he's caught out. He ends up getting out. He actually ends up surviving, being able to take down Owner in the instance to make it just a straight up 1-for-1, and then, boom, aiming triple kill, and now it's over. Like, they go bot lane, they try to dive, and they basically succeed. They get aiming 3 kills, and now you've got kills on the Zeri, you've got Twisted Fate moving around the map. Keen is still playing out of his mind on the Jax, and it just becomes incredibly difficult for T1 to actually be competent in this game at all, and all of it, in my opinion, is due to BDD's proactiveness in the early game. When he's on champions that he can actively make plays on, when he's really pushing the tempo for KT Rolster, it's the best that this team could possibly look. I love Keen, I like Aiming and Lehens a lot as players, but when this team is clicking, it's when BDD is the one with all the resources and the one that's facilitating them to the rest of the lanes. That's not to take away from the other players. Again, I can't reiterate that enough, but when BDD's in the driver's seat, you're often going to be driving in the right direction. A lot of credit to Keen this game. Another just top gap, in my opinion. The Jax was significantly more useful than the Gnar in this game. The Gnar, in my opinion, was way too over-aggressive. Again, and it's really not a matchup that Zeus plays well, particularly into Keen. As we saw in game number 2, that's 2 times now that the Gnar has just not been a good R4 pick. And I don't expect them to be going towards it in game number 5, but Aiming and Lehens also deserve credit. Now, you know, going into Guma and Keria, you just need to be able to scale them out. That's always going to be the Zeri versus Xayah matchup. We're seeing it super commonly in a lot of regions. If Zeri does get a lot of gold, she is just going to be significantly more useful because Xayah just isn't going to have nearly the same kind of damage output, but Xayah should have a lot of pressure in the early part of that laning phase. Unlucky for them, you know, the Zeri Lulu played really safe and really wasn't in a position to ever get negative. They got a bunch of gold in that dragon fight at around 8 minutes, and then they were just able to go relatively even until BDD and Cuz come down to 4-man bot and end up making it a huge KT-favored lane. Overall, KT basically doing everything that they should in this series. There really was, or in this game in particular, there really were no plays that I was like, why are you doing that? Which is such an improvement over what KT had been doing, even in their win in game number 2, where it was like, yeah, you won, but you didn't necessarily look all that good while doing it. This was a dominant win. You cannot take this away from them. They had great macro in this game, and that's really what drove them to the big dub. As for T1 on the other side, frustrating way to end the game here. This is the worst game of the series by far for you as a team, and I don't even think it's particularly close. Owner had some plays. He was able to trade gold, especially in that early dragon fight, but he wasn't really able to make use of the gold on the Lee Sin nearly as well as BDD, which is insane to me because you just heard how much I was hyping up Owner's Lee Sin. Rightfully so. Again, this is more of the outlier that he wasn't actually able to get a ton done, but really it was everybody else on the team that wasn't kind of keeping up their end of the bargain. Faker on the Galio just really wasn't accomplishing all that much. I really don't like Galio in this matchup. I know you drafted to try and match the macro and global pressure that TF offers, but Galio's just generally super weak right now. He does negative damage, and he's really not all that tanky. He's just an ultimate at this point, and the taunt is really good too, but I don't think the pick is all that good on the current patch, and then Xayah and Rakan weren't able to generate that lead in the bot lane, which just made them significantly less useful than the Zeri Lulu, but the most noticeable downgrade, in my opinion, or mismatch, I should say, on the side of T1 was the top lane. Again, Zeus is going to get another dud of the series here on Anar. It's just not a particularly good series for Zeus. He's playing way too aggro. He's building way too aggro when he really doesn't have the opportunity to do so. This was something that he, again, was doing a lot in the regular season, but he could get away with it incredibly consistently because players just weren't good enough to be able to contest him. Keen is good enough to be able to contest him, especially on a pick like Jax. And it's going to force Zeus to take this actually seriously. Hopefully, he can learn from this and maybe come back in Game 5 and look a little bit more comfortable, but Gnar R4 is just not working out for T1, and I would expect them to not go back to it. But now we get to move into game number 5, and this is the one for all the marbles. Again, neither team is eliminated by losing here. It's just one is going to be moving on to upper bracket finals, and one will be moving on to the lower bracket, kind of losing that extra life, so to speak. It is an important game to win, but it's not the end of your season, and I think both teams are excited about that because both of them are looking good in this series. But who's going to be able to come out on top? Who's going to be able to win the playoff telecom war? Well, the winner of game number 5 was T1, and it is an absolute barn burner in game number 5 here. The final game of the series, T1 is able to take it, which is good for them, but this is the LCK game of the year, and it's not particularly close. What an absolute banger of a game between these two teams who went 55 minutes, both teams eclipsing 100,000 gold in this game, 2 Elder Dragons, 4 Barons. Everything that you could possibly want was in this game. It's going to be hard to recap it all, so I'm not going to be going like event by event like I did for some of the other ones, because there simply is just too much to go over. I'll kind of just give you a good overview of what happened. Starting off, KT Rolster gets a huge lead to start the game. They get a solo kill in top lane, and then boop, oh, all of a sudden, Owner gets caught in top lane as well. Boop, oh, and then all of a sudden, Guma gets caught in bot lane. Oop, and then KT gets Dragon. Uh-oh, they get Rift Herald. Uh-oh, like, KT Rolster is legit sitting like 3k gold up at 8 minutes into this game, and it looks like it's going to be an absolute stomp. It looks like game 4 is the real KT Rolster, and they're going to waltz their way to taking down the #1 team in the entire world up until this point, but they're just not able to hold on. T1 scratches and claws back, and they're finally able to get some team fight wins around Baron. They kind of force start Baron, and they're able to pick up, I believe, like a 4-for-2 around Baron to start off, and then eventually a 5-for-0 around Baron to be able to kind of close that out. T1 kind of equalizes all the gold and then goes on a pushing spree, because now they have Baron. Now they're trying to fight for the end of the game. They're trying to end it quickly at around 30 minutes into the game, which obviously they're not able to do. BDD does a phenomenal job actually, kiting out this siege and making it really difficult for these players to actually try and finish the game. Most notably, I remember when they were sieging bot lane, a seismic shove that knocked Owner and Faker into the enemy team that almost killed both of them basically instantly. And it was really, really well played. BDD was awesome this entire series. Another really good game from him on the Taliyah. And then aiming really started to step up. A ridiculous amount of damage. T1 tries to brute force it down the mid lane, and KT Rolster is actually able to win that fight, and aiming on the Varus gets a majority of those kills. I believe he gets a quadra in that fight, and then now we get to the second Elder. And that's where the game really does end, because Gumayushi absolutely goes off in that fight. He's flashing in, he's playing super aggro on the Xayah, with ultimate and everything still up, and he's able to completely eviscerate the entirety of KT Rolster, grab Elder Dragon, and they slowly are able to finish the game off from there. What a performance from both of these teams. Neither has anything to be ashamed of in this performance, and I'll talk about that, but just really, really, really good stuff coming out from both teams. My player of the game is going to go to Keria in the support position. I know that might seem like a weird choice. I think Broadcast gave it to Faker. I think realistically you could very much give this to Gumayushi as well, but I'm going to give it to Keria because those engages were completely crucial towards what this team was actually able to accomplish towards the back half of this game. If this Rakan is not nearly as clinical, especially in a lot of those team fights around Baron, this game is just utterly doomed. And Keria saving the game for T1, not particularly a surprise. This was an MVP level performance from an MVP level player, and he stepped up and absolutely executed. Faker with some awesome plays, some great ultimates, but a phenomenal flank in the first Elder fight to kind of get on the backline. They're not actually able to do much off of that, but Faker played out of his mind, and he's still undefeated on Gragas in the mid lane. Impressive stuff Owner did a good job securing objectives towards the back half of the game. The only player that I still don't think played particularly well was Zeus in the top lane. You know, not giving out a dud of the series, but if I was, it probably would be Zeus on the side of T1, who just did not impress me really at all in this series. A lot of things to work on. The Gnar pick is just not it. Like, I don't want to see it ever again for T1, quite frankly. Like, practice it in the regular season, but not right now in playoffs. He's just clearly not going to be able to punish actually good top laners on that pick, but Guma, Faker, Keria, Owner were all so good this series. I think if I did have to give a player of the series, it's probably Guma Yushi. I think a lot of people would be up in the air about like who to give it to, and I don't think there's really a wrong answer here, but I would probably give it to Guma Yushi. He was awesome in this series. The amount of damage he was able to put out, especially in these late game team fights, incredibly impressive stuff, and it's a big reason why they were able to win the series overall, but good for T1, man. What a game. And then for KT Rolster, again, nothing to hang your head about. BDD and aiming in particular played awesome, but Keen had another really good game on the Jace. He was doing a ludicrous amount of damage. Lehans got caught out a couple of times, but he also had some super crucial ultimates and engages on the Nautilus. Really, the only player that I think didn't necessarily have like a big highlight reel was Cuz. I think Cuz actually played the early game really well, and it was a big reason why KT Rolster was able to generate such a lead. That Xin Zhao ultimate is really difficult to deal with in the early game. You don't really have a lot of tools to wait out fights to kind of get him off of that ultimate, but you know, eventually Xin Zhao's going to hit a point in the game where he's really not able to do all that much, and for a majority of the second half of this game, like, Cuz just wasn't really able to do all that much in these fights besides go in and press R. Now, that's still useful. It's a lot better than what some other people would do in this situation, and nobody in this game played bad, but I think Cuz was probably the least, like, impactful member of KT Rolster, especially over the second half team fighting phase of the game, but again, KT has absolutely nothing to be ashamed of. If you're ever going to lose, like, this is a series to lose to. This looked like the two best teams in the LCK, perhaps two of the best teams in the entire world, going head-to-head in what was one of the most fun games that I've watched in 2023, probably the most fun game that I've watched in 2023, and I'm just incredibly excited. T1 moves on now to upper finals. KT does move down to lower bracket, but if they can play like this, they're going to be fine. I'm just really excited and hoping that we could potentially be getting a rematch of these two teams, maybe in finals. And that's going to go ahead and bring us to our second series of round number 2 here. And this one is definitely just as intriguing as the first. It was a little bit of an upset in round number 1 that got us here. But now we have a matchup between the number 2 seeded Gen.G and the number 5 seeded Hanwha Life Esports. Two teams that, if you would have told me they would have been in the top 4 in the preseason, I would have been like, yeah, absolutely. These two teams make a ton of sense going against each other in round 2, but if you would have told me that like 2 weeks ago, I would have laughed in your face. Hanwha had really finished off the split in such a horrendous fashion. It really looked like they could not compete really at all with any of the teams in the upper echelon of the standings, that to see them go up against a team like D plus Kia and be able to take them down in 4 games in relatively dominant and conclusive fashion, it's just really impressive coming out from this team, and obviously they earned it. It feels like they're finally starting to reach their potential a bit in playoffs. Viper's been playing a lot better. Zeka was awesome in that series, so was Kingen. A lot of players have been stepping up recently, and I think that's been really positive for Hanwha, but this is a different kind of test. Gen.G is not DK. They are not a team that has incredibly high highs, but also incredibly low lows. Gen.G is relatively consistent, maybe the most consistent team outside of T1 in the entire league. You could argue that they play a little bit too slow for their own good, but a lot of times that means they just choke out the life from their opponents, and they're very clinical, and that's not really exactly how Hanwha Life wants to play this series. So it's going to be interesting to see this matchup, especially Pays versus Viper, the youngest player in the LCK at 17 years old versus one of the best AD carries in the entire world. Of course, Chovy versus Zeka's great. Peanut versus Clit is super volatile. A lot of really intriguing matchups here, but I think a lot of people had Gen.G favored in this one for good reason. But let's go ahead and check it out. What ended up happening in this series? Well, we're going to start, of course, with game number 1. And game number 1 was a Gen.G victory. They are able to take that first game and establish a little bit of dominance in this series, and they established dominance for sure. This was a pretty big blowout, in my opinion. Not exactly the most controversial opinion there, but, good for Gen.G. It's really good to see a team like this come out and really showed that it's like we were not a fluke at the number 2 seed. It wasn't just because DK faltered. It wasn't just because KT Rolster, you know, had a bad early part of the season and dropped games that they shouldn't. We absolutely deserve to be this 2 seed. That's the statement that Gen.G needed to come out and make. And I really do think that they made it in this game. They looked awesome basically from the beginning. Life dives super heavy in to try and get first blood onto Pays, and it's actually super close, but Delight gets the polymorph off essentially just in time to get that first blood onto the Zeri and off of the Rakan, and then we get this big skirmish in bot side river, in bot side jungle, like around Raptors, and Life just gets obliterated immediately in that fight for going in, and all of a sudden this Rakan has basically given 1 billion gold over to the Zeri. She cleans up another kill on Viper as well, and then she's accelerated. No longer is the Xayah going to be effective in this matchup because you have accelerated the pace of what Zeri is capable of doing, and that pace, shocker, never slowed down. Pays was awesome in this one. He's going to get my player of the game in game number 1. To see the youngest player in the LCK, someone who just turned 17 in December, be able to get player of the game in his first ever playoff game, it's just an incredibly impressive performance. I think Delight was obviously really good on the Lulu as well, being able to apply pressure in the early game, keep the Zeri safe, and then be able to translate that into the mid to late game. Chovy was spectacular in this game on the Ahri. I mean, charms were hitting. That ability is a little bit tricky, especially at the pro level when, you know, pros have played against Ahri a lot of times. They know the range on her particularly well, and I think Chovy was doing a really good job catching Zeka off guard in terms of the engages. Not just Zeka, but Klid and Kingin and a lot of these frontliners as well that just weren't prepared for the Ahri nearly as much as they thought they were. Peanut had a great game. I think he's had an underratedly really good season. I know a lot of people are going to point out some of the bad plays, but he's made significantly more good plays than bad plays over the course of 2023, and that was highlighted in this game. Just a really consistent game from him, and then Doran's good on the top side. Overall, Gen.G just looked solid. There really isn't a lot to talk about. This was relatively dominant. They were able to get a lead on Zeri in the early game, and then it just never was refunded, right? They had it for the rest of the game because Pays is really good at what he does. As for Hanwha Life on the other side, not exactly a great way to start the series. You probably wanted to carry some of that momentum from the DK series over into series number 2 here, but it's okay. It's just one game. It is a little bit worrisome that some of the tendencies that were shown here kind of remind me of early season Hanwha Life. You know, the team that kind of failed to be able to pick up any wins at the beginning of the year. It's Klid on Sejuani, never a good sign. It's Life running it down, never a good sign. It's Viper really not doing any damage, and these teamfights just playing way too passive. Like, this really does remind me of week 2, week 3 Hanwha Life Esports, which is maybe the biggest worrying thing I could possibly say for Hanwha Life fans. I think Zeka actually made some underratedly decent plays this game. He was able to keep up with Chovy for a while. He kind of collapsed towards the back half where he just wasn't able to do nearly enough damage, but I'm not going to blame this one on him. Kingin was fine in the top lane as well. It was kind of a wet noodle fight in the top lane for most of the game, but I blame this one almost entirely on bot lane. Life is, of course, going to get my dud of the game. It really wasn't, no question. He threw away first blood, he threw away the skirmish in bot side jungle, and then he never really had a good engage from that point onwards in the game again. Like, the Rakan was just not working out for them. If Xayah Rakan's not on the table, you gotta find something else. It was clearly not working in game number 1, but this is another game where Life just shows up and just, I should say, where Life doesn't show up and doesn't really show what he is capable of. He got a lot more consistent over the back half of the year. It was a big reason why Viper was allowed to play a lot more aggressive and why he looks so much better towards the back half, but when Life is just kind of running it down, Viper's going to have to resort to being this more passive AD carry, and I think that's going to be super detrimental to Hanwha Life. So overall, you just need to see this team be a little bit more clinical in terms of how they execute. Viper and Life are good players, but they got to be a little bit better. They have to be better than Pays and Delight. They can simply not be worse than them and expect to win this series, because Zeka versus Chovy, you're not expecting a push there. Klid versus Peanut, you're not expecting a push there. Kingin versus Doran, you're not expecting a push there. It really is up to Viper and Life, and a bad game 1 definitely leaves a sour taste, I think, in a lot of fans' mouths. But overall, Gen.G is going to have the opportunity to kind of put their stamp of approval on this series by winning game 2. If they're able to do that, going up 2-0 in any playoff series is basically a death sentence. It is very difficult to win 3 games in a row against some of the best teams in the world, but Hanwha Life is one of those teams that could genuinely do it. Hopefully they won't be in that situation because they are going to want to take that win back in game number 2, but are they going to be able to? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Gen.G. They are able to take game number 2 and move up in this series 2-0. Kind of a death sentence for a lot of people in this situation. It's going to be very difficult to win 3 games in a row against a team like Gen.G. But before we talk about the grand scheme of what exactly is happening in this series and what could be moving on in the future games, what exactly happened in game number 2? That's kind of what I'm here for. I go game by game, right? It was a little bit of a slow early game, but it was actually super similar to game number 1. Instead of Life just kind of like running it down in the bot lane, though, you had some really nice macro plays coming out from Gen.G, and this is just going to kind of be the theme. There really isn't going to be a lot to talk about outside of this kind of general theme, but Peanut and Chovy are really good at the game of League of Legends. What a massive surprise, right? Maybe the most mechanically talented player in the world in Chovy, and a jungler that I think is ridiculed over and over and over again because people just look at the flash plays. They don't actually look at pathing in terms of how they grade their junglers when we get on social media, and so these two players are still as lethal and deadly as they were last year when they were easily the best jungle mid in the entire world. I mean, maybe not easily. Kanavi and Yagao were pretty good, but I mean, I would have considered them number 1 going into that Worlds tournament, and they showed why in this series, that they still got the juice. That is absolutely the case. Nice 3-man dive to start off pretty quickly in the top lane, being able to take down Kingen, who was definitely the target of a lot of pressure this series, but then another dive on Zeka in the mid lane, another dive on Klid, and then on Kingen, and then on Life, and then on Klid, and it's like, oh, I get it. Like, Lissandra is everywhere on the map. We were talking about, you know, Owner in the previous series on the Lee Sin. It's like, how are you everywhere all the time? That's kind of how I felt about Chovy on this Lissandra. It just felt like he was everywhere on the map. He's going to get my player of the game. This was kind of a no-brainer for me. I think Broadcast gave it to Peanut, and I totally understand. Peanut had a really good game on the Vi. I certainly don't want to take it away from him, but it was this Lissandra pick that was really capping off the game for me and was really kind of the show stealer, if you will. Chovy, when he's right, is just unstoppable. I still feel so weird that I kind of snubbed him from All-Pro, but there were 4, like, legit MVP candidates in the mid lane position. Somebody had to miss out on All-Pro, and unfortunately that was Chovy for me, but obviously, he is proving me entirely wrong when it comes to that. He has been awesome so far this series. The 2-0 has been big for him, and he was ridiculously proactive. All those people out there that talk about how Chovy's not proactive, it's just so clear who actually watches Chovy play and who doesn't. Like, some people watch Chovy, you know, play on a team that, like, loses early, and all of a sudden he's in a side lane farming because he feels like he has to carry the game. And yes, that's a little bit of a problem, but when this team wins, he might be one of the more proactive mids in the entire world. Like, when he has confidence, when he feels like he has the ability to go out and give up resources in order to make these plays because he is so far ahead, like, there are very few mids in the entire world that are actually going to be able to deal with a player like that. So, Chovy looking good. Peanut was awesome. Like I said, kind of just pairing up with Chovy. Those two were roaming around the map basically together the entire game. They were making plays as a duo, and it was impossible to stop. There was no good way of stopping it. And then Pays had another really good game. Delight did as well. I want to give him credit for that, but they're just such good team fighters. Like, Pays in particular is just such a good team fighter. It's crazy to me that he is so young and that he's, you know, stepped in so easily replacing a player like Ruler, who just won MVP for this team, because he may not be, you know, what Ruler was in the early laning phase, but he certainly is what Ruler was in team fights, and that is absolutely insane to say. He really is one of the most mechanically talented ADs in the world already. It is actually ludicrous. Doran had some moments where he looked pretty bad in this game, but for the most part, it didn't really matter. Mid-jungle was so far ahead, and bot was actually doing relatively well that the game was over by like 8-9 minutes in, and so not really going to put it on him too much, but definitely something to keep in mind. Chovy and Peanut are really good. Big shocker. As for Hanwha Life on the other side, just not a very good game, not a very good series so far. Top side of the map has been an absolute disaster. Chovy and Peanut were perma-diving Kingen in the top lane, so I'm not going to give him dud of the series or dud of the game because I kind of feel bad for him. It wasn't entirely his fault that he couldn't play the game today. I'm not going to blame him for a situation where he doesn't really have all that much control over it, but I am going to blame Klid because Klid was just nowhere on the map. I mean, this was a pretty miserable Wukong performance. Klid either has a great performance where he's like player of the game, no doubt, he's awesome, or he has a horrible performance where he gets completely jungled off the Rift. There really is no in-between when it comes to Klid, especially in 2023, but unfortunately for Hanwha Life, this was the negative version of that. I think a lot of people are going to look at Zeka a little bit more negatively, but again, I think he's going to get a lot more hate than maybe he deserves in this game. There really was only so much he could do. There were a couple moments where he got caught out where I was like, ah, yeah, that is on you. But for the most part, I don't think he was the worst player on this team. To me, Klid and Kingen were definitely the two big negative influences. Life wasn't particularly good. A lot of people talk about Viper holding the world on his shoulders like Atlas, but he was fine. Like, there really wasn't, like, a big takeaway, I would say, overall for Viper. I think a lot of people are going to say that he is, like, the most consistent member, and I do agree with that. He's the only member of this team that I think is relatively consistent, basically, in any facet, but it's not like he's playing super aggro. He's playing Lucian Nami, and he's not exactly winning. I know Life not being super great plays into that factor at least a little bit, but I want to see this AD carry that dominated the LPL 4 years, that one Worlds, be able to step up and feel like he can compete with a 17-year-old, because it feels like he's just playing these lanes much too passively, and you're just not going to be able to get away with that when you're playing Lucian into Xayah. So overall, Hanwha Life's in a pretty rough spot here. They're going to have to win 3 in a row to be able to take the series, but at this point, I think they'll just take 1 if they can get it. It's been a pretty miserable series overall for them, and I think confidence-wise, they're just looking for game number 3 here. As for Gen.G, they probably just want to close it out. They don't want this series to be relatively close. They want to be able to prove that they are the better team by a lot. You know, DK was in that conversation for maybe being the second team in the league. Hanwha beat them, and Gen.G's destroying them. That's a pretty good look for Gen.G, but are they going to be able to keep it? Are they going to be able to sweep it in game number 3, or is Hanwha Life going to bring this series out at least a little bit longer? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Hanwha Life Esports. They are able to pick up the win here in game number 3, which is super integral for their chances of staying alive in this series, because obviously it was winner go home, or at least, you know, winner go to loser's bracket, which isn't exactly what this team wants to do right now. They do stay alive, they do survive in game number 3, and they actually make this a lot more interesting because they did kind of control this game, you know, kind of similar to the first 2. It was kind of one team controlled, one team was able to generate a really nice early lead, and they never really looked back. But I do think that it's a little bit more explainable in this game than maybe it was in the first 2 by some outstanding factors, most notably draft. I mean, we're going to have to talk about it every once in a while. I know I've gained a bit of a reputation on this channel for being the not draft guy, because I do say that is an asset. It is not the full puzzle, right? A good team will win with a bad draft more, like, a good team will beat a bad team if they draft poorly more than they will lose, but and if 2 teams are even, the team with the better draft will likely win. It's a factor in the puzzle, right? It's not the whole puzzle itself, but man, sometimes you do dig yourself quite a hole, and I feel like Gen.G dug themselves quite a hole by drafting Ashe Pantheon in the bot lane here. There just wasn't really a lot that this was going to do. And Delight was cooking just a little bit too hard in this one, in my opinion. I would have flexed this to the jungle. I would not have put this into the support position because they end up just going Blitzcrank on B5, and then there really is nothing that the Pantheon can actually do. He gets first blooded by getting Blitzcrank hooked. He does get a pick on Viper early on in the game, but after that, I don't think he made a single play the rest of the game. We'll talk about Delight later. Let's talk about what Hanwha did right. Clid was everywhere on the map. On Sejuani of all champions. I mean, this happened in the series before as well. He was picking Sejuani against DK and actually playing well. And then another win here against Gen.G on the Sejuani. I think he was like 0-8 in the regular season on this pick. It was something that I was talking on the channel about how he basically should never pick again. But that's 2 series in a row now that he's been able to pick up a playoff win on this champion. Good for him. He looked really, really good. Really, really good in this game. He was hitting ults left and right. He was super active, I would say, throughout the mid game in particular, and really created a lot of positive situations for Hanwha just in general. He's going to get my player of the game. I think a lot of people are going to give it to Viper in the bot lane, and I totally understand that. He was the damage here, but I don't think Viper has nearly as easy of a time in this game if it weren't for Clid on the Sejuani being able to set up a lot of what he wanted to do. But yeah, Viper was still really good. The damage coming out from Varus is honestly underrated at this point. You don't ever really hear him considered in the same conversation as picks like Jinx, but like he can very realistically do just as much as a Jinx in the late game if he is in a good spot, if he's got team that can peel around him, and if he's able to kind of fire off all of his shit, right? If he hits everybody with all of his shit, he's going to absolutely obliterate some people, and that's kind of what he did in this game. The Pantheon was not going to be able to take the damage coming out from the Varus, even in laning phase, but Ashe is certainly not a champion that's going to be able to match in terms of damage, and everybody else on the team is relatively short range. Even the other range carries, you know, like the Jace, like the Ahri, they don't really want to be out of the fight the entire time. They're going to be taking poke throughout the fight constantly, and Viper was just going to be incredibly dangerous with that. Add on top of that, you have Blitzcrank hooks coming in, and you don't really have an enemy team on the other side that wants to eat those in any way, shape, or form. It's just a really good, I guess, recipe for a really good Varus game that we ended up getting. Kingen was awesome on the Cassante. He ends up getting a solo kill in the top lane on Doran. Kingen's honestly been better this series. Doran's been pretty bad, I would say, up in the top lane matchup. Not that Kingen's been particularly good, but Doran hasn't had a particularly good series either. And this solo kill was really the first bit of action that was actually positive for either of the top laners, so good for King. And then Nzeka on the Yone, a really good knockup towards the back half of the game, but outside of that was just kind of irrelevant in this one. Overall, just a good game for Hanwha. It was a team effort, a team win. Clid and Viper kind of connecting and looking really good. When this team wins, Clid often plays well. That's just kind of how things end up working out. As for Gen.G on the other side, again, just Delight's cooking a little bit too much here. Just a little bit too spicy with the Pantheon support. I get it, you're up 2-0 in a series and you maybe just want to try something out, but this was just never going to work, especially with Blitzcrank on the board. Really nice pick by Hanwha to be able to actively punish it as hard as they did, but yeah, Pantheon was never going to be able to do anything. He got Blitzcrank hooked early, ended up giving over first blood. Like I said, he did get a pick off on Viper in the, I believe like 8 or so minutes into the game, but after that, like, not a single play. Like, he was completely useless the rest of the game. 0-6 and 5 is even generous, I think, to the contributions that he had in this game. Just really didn't do anything. Delight is a really easy choice for dead of the game. Pays was also not very good, but again, Ashe is not super high damage. She didn't actually build any of the good Ashe items in terms of, like, carrying the game, and so there really just wasn't a lot that she could do. Chovy wasn't dealing damage. Peanut actually had an alright game. I thought he was relatively fine, and Doran got solo killed in the top lane, so not exactly the most grandiose look, I would say, from the entirety of Gen.G. But overall, it's just one game. You don't want to freak out. You don't want to panic. You definitely tried some stuff. You experimented a bit here in game number 3, but I'm hoping that you kind of calm things down here going into game number 4 and end this series, as you probably should have in this game. It feels like they're kind of toying with their food with this draft here, and I don't expect them to do that for another game. But for Hanwha, hopefully this is the game that you needed in order to gain that confidence. Clid had a good one. If he has another one, like, this team can genuinely win as many games as Clid plays well. It is that simple. Zeka is just bound to pop off in a playoff game eventually. It's just what he does. And Viper's honestly been pretty good this series. So it's going to be interesting to see if Hanwha can carry this momentum from game 3 into game 4, or if the training weights are going to be taken off of Gen.G and they're going to close it out. Well, we're going to find out right now, because the winner of game number 4 was Gen.G. They are able to take game number 4 and close off the series with a 3-1 win, and this was expected. They should have been able to come into the series and be the better team and be able to win, and guess what? They actually did it. Not a lot of teams are actually performing in the LCK right now. We saw T1 get taken to the brink. We saw DK get eliminated. Not a lot of teams are living up to expectations. It really did feel like Gen.G lived up to expectations in this series. They were the better team. The only time they really didn't look like the better team was that game number 3, where they kind of trolled a little bit in draft, going for a very vulnerable pick in the Pantheon support with an Ashe that's just not going to be able to complement him all that well. But basically, outside of that, it was never out of the control of Gen.G, and it was just a very effective series overall from the team. In this 4th and final game, my player of the game is going to go to Delight in the support position. Really nice bounce back. Obviously, the Pantheon didn't work in game 3, so why don't you go play Aphelios Thresh? I mean, that is the classic, the LCK classic, and Delight is a very good Thresh player, it turns out. Obviously, we've known that over the past couple of years or so from his time on Bro, but even just watching him here, it just feels like he's evolved so much as a player over the course of the year. I think confidence has a lot to do with it. Being on a team like Breon is obviously going to be a little bit more difficult for your confidence, for your mental, but, playing with Pays, playing with Chovy, playing with Peanut, these players that are hyping you up, you feel more confident to be able to go out there and make plays because you know your team is going to have your back basically all the time, and that's kind of how Delight played the entire split. I still think that he has his problems. He's not the end-all, be-all best support in the region that I think a lot of people think he is, but he's not a bottom, 4 support like I think I thought he was going into the year, and so that's always a good thing to see from Gen.G. Player development's always been kind of their thing, and so to see Delight become a really good player, it's not a particularly surprising thing. But Pays was also really good this game again. For a 17-year-old, he was ludicrous in this series. He's actually going to be getting my player of the series in this playoff series, which is nuts. It's his first ever playoff series, and I'm giving him player of the series. It's insane, but that's just how talented he is, right? Like, players at this level typically aren't this young and performing this consistently, but he was up like 30 CS on Viper in this game. I know a lot of people are going to talk about how Viper's hard stuck, but Viper consistently lost lane every single game this series to Pays. Maybe with the exception of game 3, but again, weird draft. Like, all 3 games that Pays and Delight were able to win, games 1, 2, and 4, they dominated the laning phase. Even in a matchup like this where they really shouldn't. Like, Xayah Rakan should be able to generate that early push. It certainly shouldn't be a 30 CS discrepancy at like 12 or 13 minutes into the game. Very, very good stuff coming out from the Gen.G bot lane. They honestly just looked world-class in this series, and I'm really hoping they keep that up. Chovy was also great. I mean, he was super far up on Zeka basically the entire game, not only in terms of gold, but in terms of map pressure as well, which, as we all know, is the most important part of playing mid lane, especially in 2023. And so, Chovy did a great job there. Peanut had a phenomenal series. Doran had his best game of the series here on the Cassante. Basically, everything going right for Gen.G in this one. They looked solid. As for Hanwha, your split's not over. You're moving down to lower bracket, which means you have a chance now. We're going to be previewing that series against KT Rolster in just a second, but in this series, you just weren't all that competitive. It really didn't feel like a lot of players stepped up. Clid, Viper had a couple of good games here or there, but nothing really consistent. I think Zeka's going to get my dud of the game for this final one here. A lot of people are super critical of Zeka, and I get it, right? Like, the narrative has kind of seeped its way into everybody's brain that he can only play melee carries, which obviously anybody who watched the regular season this year knows isn't true. His Azir is legitimately one of the best in the entire world. And he's got other champions outside of that as well. He's gotten a lot better on things like the Victor and the Talia in that same vein, but it doesn't matter. The narrative has already swept its way into everybody's brain fog, and so it's just going to be there for the rest of time. I will say that this Game 4 was not particularly good. I do also want to point out that it was probably his only bad game of the series. I think Games 1 and 2 were fine. In Game 3 on the Yone, he had a really good ult, and his team won, and, he didn't have to be the carry, but this was really the only game where it felt like he was, truly outclassed on the other side by Chovy, but just not a very good Gragas game, had no pressure. Clid couldn't really do anything on the Sedge. Kingin was just kind of irrelevant in the top lane on the Gnar. A lot of people, like I said, are going to say that Viper is hard stuck, but again, kind of hard for me to call someone hard stuck when they're 30, 35 CS down at 12, 13 minutes into the game. I understand that he team fought really well and he was keeping his team in the game towards the back half, but if he was actually able to generate a lead in the bot lane, this would not have been a blowout, and unfortunately, he just didn't have a particularly good early game in any of the games this series, and it's just unfortunate. I don't want to call Viper... Okay, I'm going to be very, very hesitant with my words here. I'm going to say something, and, it's going to be a little bit of a hot take, but, just hear me out on it. I think Viper is, very quickly becoming one of the most overrated players in the world, and that's crazy to say, because I do think he's, a top 5 bot laner in the world. But I don't think that his performances in 2023 have necessarily justified the narrative surrounding him in the current moment. I think he's an incredibly talented player who just hasn't clicked with a lot of what's going on here on Hanwha Life. He's had some moments where he's looked really good, especially in the regular season, but a lot of those started to go away when they played better teams, and they did not show up in this series. I mean, Viper was not great in this series. He had some good moments, especially positioning-wise in team fights, but his laning was very suspect, and, he wasn't really all that useful, and he wasn't really all that aggressive, to be entirely honest, and so, maybe I'm going to get crucified in the comments for that, but I think the narrative surrounding Viper is a little bit too complimentary, and I think the narrative surrounding Zeka is just a tad bit too critical, in my opinion, right now. I think both probably meet somewhere a lot closer in the middle, but overall, Hanwha Life, it's definitely going to be interesting to see them take on a team like KT Rolster. We'll preview that in a second, but this is an interesting team. They still can win on any given day. It just wasn't their day today. As for Gen.G, this is legitimately one of the best teams in the world if they play like this. If Paze and Delight are like a world-class bot, that completely changes the trajectory of this team. That makes them Gen.G from 2022. And remember, that's the team I predicted to win Worlds last year when we went into that tournament. And so, I mean, this is potentially a top 3, top 4 team in the entire world right now. And I especially think that if Paze continues to develop, that they will definitely hit that milestone. But now that we have officially covered the round 2 series, it's time to preview our round 3 matchups. That's going to be our winners finals, our upper bracket finals, as well as our losers matchup to determine 4th place. I'm going to be going over both of them, kind of previewing some of the matchups in this series, and then going over my key matchup, and of course at the end giving my predictions as to who I think is going to be coming out on top. Starting, of course, with our upper bracket finals, and our number 1 seeded T1 taking on our number 2 seeded Gen.G, 2 teams that we talked about winning in this series, or in this episode, maybe in a couple of different ways. Obviously, T1 being a little bit more climactic, whereas Gen.G kind of took care of business a little bit easier, but I think you could definitely argue that T1 had the tougher opponent, and so let's look at some of the strengths and some of the weaknesses for each team. Obviously, Faker versus Chovy, it's the first thing that's going to pop out to anybody these two have faced off in the finals more than anybody in LCK history, and I don't expect that to change. We could definitely be seeing that this year if things kind of move in that direction, but for now, we get to see it in winners finals, and it's always going to be an interesting matchup. They're so similar in terms of how they want to play the game, but they're so different in terms of how they want to play the game. Chovy likes his resources, and he likes to be able to move around the map in the early to mid game, whereas Faker likes to scale a bit more. He's going to be playing, the Kassadins, the Gragas a bit more, whereas Chovy might be put on something like the Talia or the Lissandra or the Sylas that we kind of see throughout his past, year or so of gameplay. They are very similar players in terms of the impact that they have on the game, but they're just kind of polar opposites in how they end up getting there. Another interesting matchup is going to be this bot lane matchup. mostly because it's Guma and Pays, and that's a really intriguing bot lane matchup just in general to see the AD carry that has kind of been, you know, considered the weak link of his team over the course of the year, as unfair as that has been, versus the 17-year-old prodigy. I mean, Gumayushi was once the 17-year-old prodigy for T1, and he's panned out pretty well. We'll see if Pays can live up to that level. It's going to be very interesting to see those two go off. And then Keria versus Delight. Delight's been playing a lot better, but this is a real test in the support position, going up against the MVP of the entire league here in Keria. Of course, top lane is interesting. Zeus and Doran are definitely going to be two interesting players coming off of poor series, both of them, quite frankly, and going up against each other, obviously, a lot of people would assume Zeus would be able to handle this matchup relatively easily, but Doran's not a pushover. He's not somebody who gets beaten very easily, but that's going to bring us to our key matchup of the series, and again, this one's kind of a no-brainer for me. This is immediately where my mind went, because it's always about these two players when these two teams face off. My key matchup is in the jungle. It's going to be Owner versus Peanut. Arguably the two best junglers in the LCK. I would say the two best junglers in the LCK. And I think the stats back it up. I know, you know, things like XP at 5, or XP at 15, kill participation, damage percentage, not exactly like super high for all of these guys, but that's because, you know, Owner plays for T1. He's got a bunch of players on this team that lead in those categories. It's hard to get high damage percentage on a team with Faker and Gumayushi and Zeus, but, you know, same for Peanut. You know, he's 9th in damage percentage, only 0.1, you know, % lower than Owner. It's because he's on a team with Chovy and Pays, and it's like, yeah, no wonder he's 10th in kill participation, because there's a shit ton of solo kills going on. Like, it makes sense, but looking at gold per minute, first blood percentage, KDA, like, they show that they are incredibly talented junglers that can go up against anybody, and that is matched by the eye test. Whoever's going to be able to get the upper hand between these two players in this series is probably going to have a much easier time winning. Now, Owner is someone I would generally give the benefit of the doubt to, but Peanut's one of those players that if he just has a great series can beat anybody in the world. It's all just going to be about the consistency and the willingness to step up for Peanut that has always been the question mark. But for me, if I had to take a guess on where I think the series is going, I think it'll be close, but I would expect T1 to be able to take it. I'm still going to pick them to win series until they prove to me that they're not the best team in the world. It's just so hard for me to not predict them to win when they have done nothing but win all split long. I would have T1 in a 3-1. The two-game spread is T1 3-1, T1 3-2 for me. So I do think it will be close, but T1 should be able to handle it. But if Gen.G was able to come out, get a couple of games, and hell, even, you know, pressure to be able to take the series and head themselves to grand finals, I really wouldn't be all that surprised. And then moving on to our other series, this time not in the upper bracket, but in the lower bracket. This is a knockout series. Whoever ends up losing this will be eliminated from the playoffs, and we'll preview it here. It's going to be the 3-seeded KT Rolster taking on the 5-seeded Hanwha Life Esports, the two losers from today's series that we talked about in this video. And this is another really intriguing matchup. Some really, really talented players in this. Couple of former bot lane partners facing off against each other, and Viper and Lehens down in the bot lane. Obviously, former Griffin bot lane down there. That's always fun. But, you know, Viper versus Aiming is just as interesting of a matchup in general. Aiming kind of known as a more late-game carry-oriented bot laner, and Viper definitely historically more known as an early-game aggressive, you know, kind of push-the-tempo kind of bot laner, but really, it's kind of been the opposite for both of them over the course of 2023 so far. Viper's liked his team fighting a lot more, and Aiming has been a lot more willing to try to take risks earlier on in games. It's definitely going to be interesting to see if that translates into a series where both bot laners are very, very good and maybe play different styles, but it's certainly something to watch out for. And then, of course, Lehens versus Life. Lehens should have the heads up on that, but Viper versus Lehens is just such an interesting matchup on paper. Of course, topside is interesting as well. Keen versus Kingen, the two K top laners. Keen should definitely have the advantage here, but Kingen has always stepped up in the playoffs, and honestly, Kingen often plays towards his opponents. He will have some really bad series against bad players, but he'll also play fantastic against actually good top lane players. That's something that I've always admired about Kingen, is he does seem to raise his level when he plays really good teams, and Keen is very much a very good top laner. I would expect this to be in favor of KT Rolster, but I guess it's not locked in stone. Also, the jungle matchup. Cuz versus Clid. I think Klid is just like a more exaggerated version of Cuz, where I think both can be relatively inconsistent. If you get a good version of them, you can win. If you get a bad version of them, you can lose. You've just gotten way more bad Klid this year than you have bad Cuz. I think Cuz has had a super good year, especially compared to what he had in 2022, in my opinion, and Klid has just been an absolute roller coaster. There is a world here where Klid comes out and just wins the jungle matchup and really puts the team on his back, and Cuz doesn't have a very good series, but there's also a world in which Klid shows up and just isn't able to play at all, and Cuz dominates him like he did in the regular season. But that's going to bring me to my key matchup. It's the only one left. It's going to be the mid lane matchup between BDD and Zeka, two very important players to their respective teams, and really I had to make it this matchup even though I just did Zeka for a key matchup, because these are the two players that kind of decide the destiny of their own teams. When Zeka plays well, Hanwha Life often wins. When BDD is playing at an MVP level, KT very rarely struggles to win games. Like, when they are on, they are dominant. I mean, BDD's first in kill participation, fourth in gold difference in 15, second in KDA, fourth in gold per minute. He's low in the damage percentages, but that's because he's giving up on a lot of resources or damage, right, to go and help out the rest of the team, which is majorly positive. But you look at Zeka, and it's actually kind of different. He's super high in damage. He's second in damage percentage, fourth in damage per minute, but a lot lower in things like kill participation. And that just shows that he's, I don't want to use the word selfish, but he's a little bit more resource heavy in terms of how he likes to play the game. Two kind of polar opposite styles going up against each other, but both equally as important to their own team's success. It's very much going to be about which one of these mid laners can facilitate the rest of their team more. If Zeka can get ahead and start to carry again, HLE is going to be in a good spot. If BDD is able to facilitate Cuz and, you know, aiming to have a really good series and Keen to be these monsters that they can be mechanically, then KT is probably going to be almost impossible to stop. And so I definitely think mid lane is going to be my key matchup of the series. And if I had to guess, I would say that KT should have this one. My prediction is actually going to be pretty similar to the upper bracket series. I'm going to predict KT 3-1 with the spread of KT 3-1, KT 3-2. They should be able to take the series, but Hanwha would not shock me to take a couple of games. It also wouldn't shock me for KT to win this series 3-0. I absolutely think that there is a world in which HLE just doesn't show up, and there's a world in which HLE wins this series comfortably, but if I had to guess, I would say KT should be the favorites here, and they should be the favorites by a considerable amount. Not a large amount, but like a noticeable amount. Alright, that is going to do it for my LCK Round 2 overview and analysis of both of the series in the upper bracket. We now know who's going to be in winners finals. We know who's going to be fighting for their lives next week. Both of those series have been previewed as well. I really do hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, let me know down in the comment section below what you thought of the video, what you guys think of the slides, the presentation. You know I love feedback on this kind of content. I really do appreciate you guys letting me know all that down in the comment section below. Of course, if you enjoyed the video, let me know by hitting the like button. That's the best way to tell me that the content is getting across to you guys. Of course, it helps get this video out to more people as well, so kind of a win-win scenario. And then, of course, if you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We don't only cover the LCK on this channel, we cover all 4 of the major regions, as well as the NACL, with all of them, except for the LEC, being in playoffs right now. We've got a lot of awesome coverage on this channel coming through the next month. We're uploading 33 days in a row, and we're kind of in the middle of that right now, so if you're enjoying the content, I promise this is the one-stop shop for all your LoL Esports needs. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.